This video is meant to introduce soil nutrients, soil fertility, and nutrient cycling in soils. But to get there, I thought we might take a bit of a roundabout way and to continue talking about soils as an ecosystem and as a complex natural resource. We know that soil fulfills a variety of functions. It is there to hold and provide nutritious substances and the water necessary for plant growth. It's there as a living source for organisms and decomposing substances. It's there to absorb, store, and reflect the sun's energy, well, and to provide a surface for us and other animals to exist. In doing so, soils more or less function as an open system and key interface that includes the cycling of water and nutrients between atmosphere, biosphere, pedosphere, and the geosphere. So we have inputs of matter and energy, we have outputs of matter and energy in this open system, and they not only happen at the soil interface, but they also happen in the subsurface. And in doing so, the soil fulfills a variety of functions, including storage, filter, buffer, transformation, and it's all part of being an open system and being in key interface in all of these functions. Now, we as humans do derive a variety of ecosystem services from it, and ecosystem services are the things that directly benefit us. And almost all of them are in one way, directly or indirectly, linked to soil and water resources. And we commonly look at them as they are provisioning services. They are food, water, fiber, genetic resources, and so forth. They are regulating services, meaning regulation of flooding, diseases, water quality, waste treatment, regulation of climate. There are cultural services, meaning services for recreation, they're aesthetic, recreational, spiritual, archaeological preservation, and then there are supporting services. Well, in some way they could be considered as part of regulating and maintenance services, but they were put out there as an additional group of services. And of these, there are soil formation and, of course, the cycling of nutrients that we need to talk about in this video. So looking at ecosystem functions, services, and processes can be done with a whole variety of models and frameworks. There's not one that is universally applicable or useful. Here's another one that I like, and it's one that uses soil natural resource capital as the lens to explore these. In this model or framework, we have ecosystem services just like before, provisioning, regulating, and cultural, and you see that the supporting services are missing from this list here. And that is because they're actually put out into a different class of things that is grouped together with processes. And here we have processes that can be beneficial, the supporting processes like nutrient cycling, water cycling, biological activity, and so forth, and some that would lead to deterioration of soil resources, so degradation, erosion, compaction, and whatnot. These processes inform and interface together with the soil properties, and we could look at them as stocks. And there's some that are inherent, that are not easily changeable, and then some that are easily manageable. So the inherent properties are things like soil texture, mineralogy as it relates to the geology and the climate and all the soil forming factors that we've learned, soil depth and so forth, versus manageable properties like the organic matter content, pH to some extent, soil structure, very much so management depending, and nutrients in terms of as we apply nutrients to the soil. From these stocks then that are made up of inherent and manageable properties, we derive the ecosystem goods and services. And here we might actually add one that is not a service in a positive sense, but a disservice. And those can also be derived from a degraded soil. These ecosystem goods and services then are the ones that provide us as humans with the needs and the values that we assign to them. And because of our value system and the needs that we derive from them, we may have an interest through policies, regulation, best management practices, stewardship to inform how we change land use, how we interface with climate change, to alter or support processes, or maybe to accelerate processes that would have degrading properties. So altogether then, the stocks in the system are natural capital that we can either build or that we can squander as we in this whole system derive services from it, make changes, inform changes in the system as we alter processes in the system. And as you can see, the supporting processes here are prominent as well, that we have water cycling, nutrient cycling, biological activity, without whom we would not be able to derive the ecosystem goods and services that we as humans rely on. Quite a few of the ecosystem goods and services that we depend on built on the growth and development in plants. And this is in turn determined by a number of factors of soil and climate and factors inherent to plants themselves. But what they all need is some source of energy, water, and carbon, which they get from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if you take a plant and you run an elemental analysis, to no surprise would you find that the plant is mostly made up of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, plus some essential nutrients. And they're called essential because they're either a necessity for the plant to complete its life cycle, or they are directly involved in the nutrition of the plant. Of those, we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as major macro ions. Then we have calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and those together with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the macronutrients that we introduced earlier, plus a number of micronutrients that are needed in much smaller quantities than the macronutrients. The nitrogen is mostly used in proteins, chlorophyll, coenzymes, and nucleic acids. So basically it's used everywhere in the plant. Phosphorus is important for energy transfer as part of the adenosine triphosphate, and it's a constituent of many proteins, coenzymes, acids, and metabolic substrates. And potassium, well, that one isn't really used in plant compounds, but it functions in regulatory mechanisms like photosynthesis, carbohydrates translocation, and protein synthesis. Calcium, that we said is another one of those that is used in relatively large quantities, is used in cell wall components and plays a role in the structure and permeability of membranes. Magnesium gets used for chlorophyll and enzyme activators, and sulfur is an important constituent of plant proteins. All in all, we need to have the right amount of all of these available at the right time in the plant development stages. Plants derive these nutrients from the soil, and they derive them in part by root elongation, increasing root mass and root volume, exploring new areas of soil and mining them for these nutrients. These nutrients will have to be in solution to be able to move towards the root, and in the past we've talked about that most of these nutrients come in ionic form. We've talked about how the root has to, in order to maintain charge balance, extrude charged ions as it takes up ions. Well, most of these ions, as they move towards the root, are going to be moved in soluble form by mass flow, meaning the bulk flow of water towards the root, and that water being then used in transpiration and photosynthesis. For calcium and sulfur, and to some extent also for most nitrogen, the mass flow is usually sufficient to supply enough of these nutrients towards the root. For some of the ions that are less soluble, diffusion plays a larger role. And here, diffusion is because there is a concentration gradient that has established because the root takes up a particular ion, and then there's a movement of these ions from high to low concentrations in this mechanism of diffusion. Once these nutrients and ions have moved to the root surface, then, well, the plant needs to exert energy to uptake those ions. So if root respiration is curtailed, maybe because there isn't enough oxygen available in the soil system, then the uptake of nutrients is minor, even when the solution around the root is concentrated. And then also, the uptake of nutrients is selective, or the plant is selective in what it can take up, and it can exclude ions in favor of ones that it really wants to use. Either way, all these nutrients, like we've said before, occur in solution or have to occur in solution to be available to the plant and move towards the root soil interface. And these nutrients in solution aren't always there, but we have a couple of storage mechanisms that we've discussed in the past. There's the cation exchange capacity, which is an easily exchangeable, really fast way of exchanging nutrients between the soil solution and these charged sites. We have nutrients that are locked away in more easily digestible, labile organic matter, which is not going to be as fastly available to the plant, but is certainly going to be faster than the stuff that is locked away in stable organic matter, humus, or in the parent material, which provides a really slow backup resource, if you like, for nutrients in solution. The other pathways that nutrients in solution may take, if they are not stored, are a leaching loss, where they are lost to the system, and then whatever might have been lost to the system may be replenished via fertilizer applications. The nutrient availability for plants and for ecosystems is, of course, not just affected by the solubility of them, by the transport mechanisms, or by the storage mechanisms within the soil, but they're all limited resources. So in order for ecosystems to function, they have to undergo biogeochemical cycles that are oftentimes coupled with each other to continuously supply ecosystems as we go through time. And we've looked at them previously. For example, we've looked at the carbon cycle, although we've never actually spelled it out as a carbon cycle. Let's say we start out with atmospheric carbon dioxide. It gets assimilated in the plant through the process of photosynthesis, and then we have litter or leaf fall contributing to dead biomass, or we have mycorrhization and eventually mortality leading to the dead biomass, which then through decomposition, of course, contributes to the soil organic matter formation. And then through respiration, we are returning all of this carbon back to the atmosphere. So plants and animals need not just the carbon, but they also need nitrogen, and that nitrogen most likely comes from an atmospheric source, but the atmospheric nitrogen is actually not available to them. So we need nitrogen fixing bacteria to convert it into a bioavailable form of nitrogen, and once we have that, then we can assimilate or immobilize that nitrogen in plant tissues or into organic tissues of sorts. Then, of course, that nitrogen might in part be made available to the plant through mycorrhizal associations, or then undergo the mortality and decomposition phase, be locked up in the soil organic matter in one way or the other. That nitrogen that is in the soil organic matter can then be slowly remineralized, so be made bioavailable again, or it can also leach out of the system. The other pathway, and the one that eventually completes the cycle, is the one of denitrification, and again here bacteria are involved that turns the bioavailable nitrogen in the soil back into atmospheric nitrogen, and that will usually happen under oxygen limited conditions. The other nutrient that's oftentimes limiting in ecosystems is phosphorus, which starts out as a mineral form, was an insoluble form that through weathering processes turns into a soluble phosphorus form, which then can be assimilated or immobilized much the same way that nitrogen does. And it cycles through the food chain and undergoes decomposition just like most of the other nutrients, and then gets freed again or returned to a soluble form through mineralization. There are some more intricacies to both the nitrogen cycle and the soluble phosphorus cycle that of course don't really fit on this graph here, and we're going to have a separate video that deals in detail with the nitrogen and phosphorus cycling. But what I meant to do with this was to show you that these biogeochemical cycles don't function in isolation, but they are coupled and intertwined with each other. And well, quite frankly, that's how ecosystems work in real life. So everything depends on itself. And not only does it depend on the cycles in this coupled fashion, but it also interacts with the physical environment and the hydrologic environment of the soil that we spend so much of our semester on.